Chapter 2. As the leave train rattled and bumped its leisurely course across France, I thought hard, not of the few carefree days before me, but of what would happen when I came back. What was I to do? It was quite certain that I should be asked once again to go behind the German lines, for although my success had been perilously near a disaster for myself, high officers have a nasty habit of overlooking such questions of detail. However, undoubtedly, I had the right to refuse if I wished. No compulsion was ever employed on jobs of this kind, obviously, for it would be only too easy for the man concerned to give himself up. It was realized in all circles that a different kind of courage is needed in the man who pushes his head into the noose alone, as compared with that bravery which makes a man advance against heavy fire, but alongside his comrades. So, on all occasions, the most dangerous form of intelligence work, that behind the enemy line, was always undertaken by volunteers. So I pondered, had I already done my share? After all, so far as I knew, no Englishman had yet done as much in that particular direction, and yet could I sit back and resign myself for the rest of the war to the mere interrogation of prisoners, a job which could well be done by hundreds of other intelligence officers, of whom few or none possessed just those added qualifications which fitted me for special work behind the enemy line? I argued out the question with myself at great length, but when that grand old castle at Dover appeared on the horizon, I forgot all about personal trivialities. This was England, the England which a week before I had certainly never expected to see again. So I postponed judgment. Let me have my leave first. My natural intention had been to hurry home at once, but on the train to Dover, to Victoria, I ran into a brigadier from my own division who knew me and had heard of my exploit. When we arrived at Victoria, there were telegrams awaiting us both, stating that His Majesty the King was holding a levee on the following day, and that we were to attend for our decorations to be presented, for the brigadier had received the CMG for his services during the recent fighting. I was dismayed, for my uniform was an old one, and I was in no fit array to be presented to the king. The brigadier, who very kindly insisted on my staying the night with him, knew the unlimited facilities of London better than I did. He pointed out that there are excellent shops where they specialize in hiring out attire for all state occasions. I might even hire a court dress if ever I wanted one. I'm not likely to. I think it is rather a silly costume, but the firm he took me to fitted me immediately with a spick and span uniform. So I received the king's handshake and was admitted to the companionship of the Distinguished Service Order. The brigadier insisted that I should stay another night with him, and as I had a fair length of special leave before me, I agreed particularly when he told me that his wife was throwing a party in honor of his return, and that there would be a good many well-known military men present, so that night I went to the party, which was held in the house in a fine street just to the north of Hyde Park. I met a good many people who had hitherto been only names to me, people I had certainly never dreamed of meeting on terms of equality. Yet, strangely enough, I have forgotten all about them, although some of them were world-famous men, for this brigadier, although of comparatively humble rank amongst the crowd of brass hats, was a member of a very old and honored military family, and of the highest social standing. I palled up with a captain of the Royal Flying Corps, with whom I discovered a mutual acquaintance in young Palmer. He, too, was a man of family, and seemed to know everybody. As they entered the room, he told me their names, and gave me a potted history, which was very useful when I came to be formally introduced. There was one man among the whole crowd whom I did not forget, and whom I have not forgotten to this day. He was not distinguished looking from the military point of view. He wore the badges of a captain, but he looked far more like the cartoonist's idea of a learned professor than a military man at all. Tall and exceedingly thin, the only distinguishing feature about him was the great, broad forehead, which crowned an exceptionally small face. It was as if nature had stinted him right up to the brain box, and then had let herself go properly. Beside him was one of the most beautiful girls I ever remember seeing, magnificently dressed in a stylish taste, which made everyone turn to look at her. I turned to my companion, and asked who that couple might be. "Ah, you must meet him," he said. "You will be very interested to know him. He's a coming man." "What's his name?" I asked. "Hart." The name meant nothing to me. To the best of my knowledge, I had never heard it, but as soon as this Hart had got clear of his formal greetings, my friend slid up to his side, drew him away, and brought him over to the corner, where we had been sitting. He introduced me, mentioning to Hart that I was the man who had carried out the raid on the Linz Railway, of which everybody apparently had heard. Hart showed signs of great interest, and I was very struck by the fact that instead of indulging in sentimental rhapsodies like most of the people I had talked to, he immediately got right down to the root idea, underlying the plan I had endeavored to carry out, that is, the importance of keeping reserves from the field of action, not just for the first hour, but for the first 24 hours, and he commented somewhat caustically on the other side of the question that it is just as essential for the attackers to have all the reserves handy so that they can be used while the enemy reserves are missing. I took to this man at once. It was obvious that his cranial makeup did not belly the truth, for he seemed to me to be literally bulging with brain. It was delightful to listen to him. I had been mingling for some months with staff officers and highly placed generals who were thinking hard over problems involving the capture of a few square yards of ground, and who seemed to be incapable of thinking further than a couple of miles behind the German line. But here was a man who saw the war in perspective. As he explained things to me, it seemed that for the first time I saw the war as a whole and not as a mere sideshow. I made lots of mental notes as he talked, determined to ponder at leisure over the ideas he suggested. Sometimes he quoted from military authorities, but more often he was expounding his own ideas. I particularly remember a kind of sermon which he preached from the text of Napoleon's axiom, that the aim of an army was the mind of the enemy commander. That is to say, that the object of a general is not merely the defeat or even destruction of the forces opposed to him, but loss of nerve and confidence in the mind of his opponent. A war is not won until you have persuaded the enemy commander he is beaten. To do that, it is not always essential to defeat his army. On the other hand, even if you have beaten his army, it does not necessarily follow that you have won the war, for war is a matter of nerve, and often of stamina. The winner of the first battle does not always finish on the right side. M. Venizelos knew a bit of something when he decided to join us because the English in a war always win one battle, the last. I ought to say at this juncture that my friend of the Royal Flying Corps was quite right. Hart was one of the men who was destined to go a long way. Not only during the war, when he commanded a battalion, was his reputation made. Since then he has become famous. Indeed, he is at the moment, I should say, the best known military writer in the world. He is better known as Captain B.H. Little Hart, the famous military correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. I thought of this conversation often and often during the next few months. I thought of it very forcibly only a couple of days later, for as soon as I reached home and had got over the joyous welcome, my mother exclaimed excitedly, "Well, have you heard the news? Your cousin Adolphe has been taken prisoner and is in a camp at Hollyport, in Cheshire." This was, of course, interesting, and later in the week I got a permit to go and see him. I thought it might be useful to get his viewpoint, and in any case I was very fond of Adolphe, with whom I had passed very many happy weeks. Now that he was a prisoner, he could do us no further harm, and I could not see that I was doing my country ill service if I offered to do any little thing for him that would lighten his captivity. I found him at Hollyport, grinning and making the best of it. He told me how he came to be captured, how he and the remnant of his company were completely surrounded near Hullock. Strange that he should be within 5 miles of me, and neither of us know it. And he concluded his recital by saying, "Yes, it was damned hard luck, and the hardest luck of all, that this would have been my last battle." "Why, how do you mean?" I asked. I had been gazetted to the staff, he said. I had been given a staff appointment, and it is highly probable that I would never have had to serve in the line again. So that's damned hard luck, you must agree. And as I took the train back home, I was thinking back hard. There was Adolphe, prisoner in England, yet who ought to be on the German General Staff? The aim of war is the mind of the enemy commander, Hart had insisted. Was there any connection between the two ideas? Suppose I, and not Adolf, could take up that position on the German staff. What an opportunity it would be! I was excited as I thought of it, yet my natural caution returned. I remembered that only a few days before I had been tried by court-martial and condemned to death. I had gone behind the German lines, quite convinced that I could hold my own against anything, and yet a couple of trifling details had floored me. The same thing might easily happen again, and this time there might be no chaplain to comfort me in my last moments. Nevertheless, the idea stuck. There was something in my blood, I suppose, which drove me on, never thinking of the more ordinary forms of warfare. Human hybrids, I have remarked, are seldom quite normal in outlook. Even before I reached home, I had the rough outline of a scheme ready planned, and the next day I rushed up to London, routed out my friend the brigadier, and got him to take me to see a very responsible officer in the War Office to put the plan before him. My scheme was promptly pooh-poohed. The War Office always held large reserves of cold water. Their attitude towards the tank and its development will be well remembered, but the more opposition I got, the more determined I was to carry it through. Once again, my mixed ancestry was a blessing. My mother's brilliant effervescence might have faded before such a rebuff, but I had also the hard-headedness of the Midland farmer. Priceless inheritance from my father. I sent a telegram to my intelligence chief at GHQ in France, and the following day he was in London. Together we went to the War Office, and this time saw a man of higher authority. My chief adopted my scheme in every detail, and insisted that at least it should be given a chance. He pointed out that its cost, if it failed, was negligible, merely my life, but its results, if it succeeded, were incalculable. So at last I was given more or less a free hand, and proceeded to work out all my details. This time I felt on absolutely firm foundations. Previously I had assumed the identity of a man who was almost unknown to me. I could only talk of things of which he had talked to me, and as it had turned out, these limitations had in part led to my undoing, but I knew almost as much about Adolf as he did himself. I could talk intelligently and with certainty of every member of his family, of every detail of his daily life. Furthermore, I had a strong family likeness to my cousin. Once in Germany, I could play his part with the utmost confidence. My only anxiety, in fact, my first determination, was that I must arrive in Germany in such circumstances as would completely disarm the possibility of suspicion. So I got to work. Adolf, in his camp at Hollyport, suddenly received the order that he was to be transferred to Donington Hall. This was my first step. Adolf set out under armed guard, but he never arrived at Donington Hall. Instead, he was sent to a military prison up in Scotland and detained there. I was sorry for Adolf, for now none of his letters could be sent home, for obvious reasons. For while Adolf was taken to Scotland, I took his place on the journey from Hollyport to Donington Hall. The guard were cautioned that in no circumstances must they say a word. I was handed over formally to the governor of Donnington Hall, who was in the secret, but who treated me exactly the same as he would have done any German officer. It had been necessary, of course, to transfer Adolphe, since it might be dangerous for me to take his place in the Hollyport camp. There he might have formed acquaintances, of whom I had no knowledge, and I might easily have given myself away. I chose Donnington not at random, but because the War Office already had a report that 2 naval officers were planning to escape. They had been on the point of ordering their removal to another and more difficult camp when my scheme burst upon them. As the situation was just as I wanted, I adapted it to meet my own plan. The 2 naval officers I found were not old friends, but had joined together in their scheme, one because he had the ideas, and the other because he could speak English. I had the second one removed, therefore, knowing full well that the first man would immediately look round for another partner, and as I was going to air my knowledge of English in speaking to the guards, the first part of my plan ought to work very smoothly. I was received at Donnington naturally without the slightest suspicion. Very soon I had picked out the naval officer whose plan to escape was already known to the authorities. He was a lieutenant of the submarine service named Freiberg. Nothing happened for a few days, and I was wondering, in fact, if I should force the issue by beginning to talk publicly of escape. Yet I waited a while, for it would obviously be stronger if the suggestion should come from him. All the while I aired my perfect English extensively, and I saw from the first moment that I had excited his interest. Donnington Hall was of course an old English mansion in Leicestershire, which had been converted for the purpose of housing officer-prisoners of war. I knew the place of old, for it was not more than 10 miles from my home. A portion of the extensive park was allotted to the officers for exercise, but around it were several belts of barbed wire. The question of escape was obviously going to be a difficult one, though in emergency the War Office could play into our hands. But I did not want this to happen. I wanted to get away by purely natural means. Freiberg fell right into my trap, as I knew he would. He got me alone one day while we were walking around the house, and asked me to meet him later when the other officers were turning in prior to dinner. I did so, of course, and then he sounded me very cautiously, asking if I were game to make an attempt to escape. Naturally, I said that I was. Had he any ideas? Yes, apparently he had a very novel idea. After getting out of the camp, he would go to a secluded part of the coast, where he would arrange a rendezvous with a submarine. This was something new to me. I had not expected anything quite so melodramatic. Actually, I found that the idea had been unsuccessfully essayed only a few weeks before by a prisoner from the Dyfrynolad camp near Denbigh. Freiberg had first been confined in this Denbigh camp, and had talked over the idea with Tholins before the latter tried it out. His preparations were in an advanced stage. A few weeks previously, an officer had been invalided home, exchanged for an English wounded officer prisoner. Through him, Freiberg had sent a message to the German Admiralty asking that a submarine should be sent to the same spot where Tholins had so narrowly escaped success, Great Orme's Head near Llandudno. He had selected the same spot because the authorities would never expect such a repetition. He had duly received a reply purporting to be a letter from his sister in which she informed him that she expected her baby to be born on October the 29th. That meant, of course, that the submarine would be there on that day, or rather that night. Freiberg's present concern was time. It was now October 20th. He had everything prepared for escape. He had even managed to procure the very essential pair of wire clippers which had been sent to him from Germany, concealed in a cheese. But when the authorities removed his partner, they knocked the bottom right out of his scheme, because Freiberg scarcely spoke a word of English, and would certainly be discovered long before he reached Llandudno. So he asked me to come in, and I agreed. He was very nervous lest we should be discovered, or lest any detail should go wrong. But I assured him confidently that we could pull it off, as of course I knew we should. I may say that my chief had a big struggle with the Admiralty before Admiralty complained that it was very dangerous to allow a submarine to come unhindered right up to the very coastline. They wanted to take advantage of my information and to sink or capture it. Never mind about my plan. A very high political authority had to intervene, finally to decide that it was my idea which must go forward, for, as I argued, if we succeeded in escaping by this method, as certainly we should, then other German officers might be tempted to repeat it, and it should not be too difficult to make them act as unconscious decoys, leading submarines to their doom. Freiberg was delighted when, without hesitation, I agreed to throw in my lot with him. There was only one detail which needed to be settled: my clothes. For himself he had no fear, since the German naval uniform is very similar to the British, and a little amateur tailoring would suffice at the very last minute to turn his uniform into a passable imitation. But my own case was different. I had no plain clothes whatsoever. For trousers there would be no difficulty, since he had a spare pair, but he could not complete the uniform, nor, as it happened, was there another naval officer in the camp. But I made a suggestion to him. I had already explained my command of English by mentioning the fact that I had a distant cousin in England. I thought it wise to make that clear right from the start, lest there might be suspicion if it were found out accidentally. Inasmuch as my cousin's home was not very far away from Donington Hall, suppose I asked him to come and visit me. Then we might be able to steal some part of his clothes. So I wrote to myself at my own home, and 2 days later my brother, purporting to be myself, came to see me. Naturally, we tried no melodramatic method. There was no drugging or stunning and stealing his clothes, but he did wear a fawn trench coat of the kind universally popular at that time. When Freiberg saw it, he gave me violent nudges. I pretended to see his idea, though actually I had asked my brother to wear his coat when he came, so when he rose to go, he asked me if there was anything he could do for me. I did ask for 1 or 2 luxuries in the way of food, but above all, I said, I want something in the nature of a coat to keep out this wretched climate of yours, for when I was taken prisoner, I had only the clothes I stood up in, and nothing has yet arrived from Germany. If you could get me a coat of the type you're wearing now, that would tide me over the time until my great coat arrives from Germany. My pseudo-cousin went one better than that. He offered to lend me his own. I thanked him profusely and asked him not to mention it to the guard, as they might think that I had arranged the whole thing. After he had gone, Freiberg and I shook hands and danced round the room in joy. With this raincoat I could cross England without fear. Several escapes from Donington Hall had already been effected, although in every instance I think the prisoners had afterwards been recaptured. Not until the last moment did we let other officers into our secret, for it was essential to have someone to get us past the roll call after we had got away, in order to give us a longer time before the pursuit started. The details of our escape were not original, but in spite of all the efforts of the guard, it was almost impossible to upset our plans. Before evening roll call, we hid in the grounds. At roll call, we had arranged that when our names were called, we would be reported as sick in bed. Then 2 of our comrades, immediately the parade was dismissed, would dash off and get into our beds, so that the orderly sergeant, on going to confirm this report, would be quite satisfied. It was a dark night, and the rain which poured down kept the sentries to their boxes. After roll call, naturally every officer was confined to the hall, and the sentries guarding the wire were very few, most of them having been brought in to the inner circle of wire guarding the house itself. At 6:30 we heard from the hall a lusty chorus of voices singing Deutschland über alles. This was the signal to us that all was well and that the roll call had passed without suspicion. We had arranged that the roll call the following morning should be similarly faked by 2 officers rushing round from one room to the other and being counted twice. We waited until nearly midnight, so that there would be no one about, except the sentries actually on duty. Freiberg did not know that the sentry normally patrolling near the point where we were to cut through the wire had been withdrawn for that particular night. The wire was brilliantly illuminated with arc lamps, and in the absence of interruption did not give us nearly so much trouble as one would have thought. The barbed wire we cut through laboriously, but without difficulty. One problem was to get through the electric alarm wires, which completely surrounded the camp. This we solved by scraping narrow crawling channels beneath them. By 2 o'clock we were free. Freiberg thanked his lucky star, time and time again, that he had chanced upon me, for not only did I know English, but I had at least a fair idea of the country, having visited my cousin some 10 miles away on several occasions. So we walked through the night into the little town of Colville. As soon as the shops opened, I bought a civilian hat and then took first-class tickets on the morning train to Burton-on-Trent. Here we spent the rest of the day, for there was a through train at tea time to North Wales, and this we boarded. Everything was going well, so well in fact that Freiburg became nervous. There was an old lady of the aggressive type in the carriage as far as Crewe. She wanted to talk with Freiburg very badly to get first-hand information from a naval officer, but he pretended to be suffering from a terrible toothache and left it to me to do all the talking. We were 2 days early, so I thought it best not to make for a small town like Llandudno, where we might easily be spotted, but to spend the time in a big city where we could hang about in freedom. We read in the newspapers about our escape, and Freiburg chuckled when I translated to him that we were supposed to have made for London. I put one of the newspapers in my pocket. It contained a photograph of me and might be very useful evidence, so we stayed the 2 days in Manchester, putting in most of our time at cinemas, which not only keep out the rain, but are conveniently dark. I even did a bit of shopping there, and fitted myself out with more serviceable clothes. In the afternoon of the 29th, we took a train for Llandudno, arrived there before dusk, and set out at once for Great Ormy's Head, for we knew we must climb down the cliff before it was yet dark. We passed only one man on the cliff. He was a Coast Guard lookout man of some grade, but instead of suspicion, he gave to Freiburg a most effusive salute, imagining him without doubt to be a naval officer on some mysterious mission. Not until the night was halfway through did we venture to signal. Then, with a little electric torch I had bought in Manchester, we made the agreed flashes. Nothing happened. Again and again we shone our faint light out to sea. No response. I was even more alarmed than Freiburg. Suppose something had gone wrong at the critical moment. Suppose the German Admiralty had not sent the submarine after all. Or far more likely, suppose the submarine had met with an accident, or had been destroyed by a British warship. But while we were considering all the possibilities, we saw, to our relief, an answering signal about 200 yards from the bottom of the cliff. We flashed back, and very soon heard the soft tap of paddles on the water. A little collapsible boat was approaching, yet the cliff was so steep that it was impossible for us to board it. There was only one thing to do. We had to jump into the icy cold water and swim to the boat. It was only a matter of a few yards, but it seemed more like miles to me, who am but a moderate swimmer. When we reached the boat, too, was such a frail cockle shell that it was impossible to think of getting into it from the water, so a rope was trailed behind, and the sailors rowed as quickly as they could back to the submarine. There we were, immediately taken on board, given hot drinks and rolled into blankets, for even the 10 minutes immersion in that icy cold sea was no joke, believe me. I went to sleep and woke up next morning with a strange feeling of exhilaration. Once again, the first part of my scheme had been a triumphant success. Whatever happened, Freiburg would be prepared to swear on his life to all the world that I was Captain Adolphe Newman, certainly not Captain Bernard Newman. I looked forward to my journey, one of the strangest I've ever made. It took over 10 days, for the submarine went right round by the north of Scotland, since its commander was afraid to make the perilous passage along the English Channel. But at last we passed through the minefields and entered the port of Wilhelmshaven. There my job began. What was to happen next? My first movements were soon decided. Immediately the captain of the submarine had reported his success to the German Admiralty. An order came by telegram for us to proceed to Berlin, since the Kaiser himself wished to see the 2 young officers who had carried out such a marvelous exploit, and it tickled my sense of humor as I stood before him stiffly while he asked us question after question. Only a few weeks previously, the King of England had presented to me the medal of the Distinguished Service Order. Now the Kaiser of Germany pinned a medal on the same spot, the Iron Cross of the German Empire. Chapter 3. I was of course offered a week's leave to visit my family. I need hardly say that Donaueschingen was the last place I thought of visiting. I was confident of my ability to deceive casual acquaintances and military comrades, but I was quite certain that once I got in the arms of Adolphe's family, I would naturally be found out in about 5 minutes. So I wrote home and explained that I had escaped, but that the exigencies of the service prevented me from returning at that time. I stayed in Berlin. I should say that before I left England, in fact, before I impersonated Adolphe at Donington Hall, I had taken a rapid course of training in handwriting. Under the guidance of an expert, I had learned to imitate Adolphe's writing, so that nothing less than the keenest scrutiny would reveal the difference. Even if it were queried, I could always plead a wound in my hand to make my excuse foolproof. A doctor, a very skillful man at this kind of thing, had made a small incision over the first knuckle of the first finger of my right hand. It was nothing more than a skin wound, but he treated it in such a way that when it healed it left a considerable scar, and still does to this day, so that any vagary in handwriting could be easily and reasonably explained. My first anxiety was of course about my job. I hoped that my capture and imprisonment would not have lost me my chances of the staff appointment, which had been promised before the Battle of Loos. I was even thinking in terms of Adolphe by now. I could almost convince myself that I had served in his battalion and had really been promised the staff appointment. My inquiries were anxious and forcible, therefore I pointed out that now I would be doubly valuable on the staff, since apart from my knowledge of the German army, I now knew something of the British Army too. However, I need not have worried, for when my leave had expired and I returned to the War Office in Berlin, I was ordered, to my secret delight, to report at once to General Headquarters, then situated at the little town of Mezieres Charleville, just over the French border, on the Meuse, and thither I hurried. What would be my fate? To what section would I be posted? Naturally, I hoped for an operations appointment, for there I would be in the closest touch with the German intentions. I ought at this stage to make my own position perfectly clear. I was now, for all practical purposes, a German. My life depended on the successful living of the character I had adopted. Any slip would obviously be fatal, and I could not again expect the stroke of luck which had served me so well at Lens. Here, in the unhurried atmosphere of a headquarters, there would be none of the flurry of the war area. Things would be done deliberately, and it would be impossible to depend upon chance. It was obvious, too, that I had to do the job I was allotted, and had to do it well. Otherwise, I could never succeed in holding my appointment, for it was not sufficient in the German army, as it was sometimes in the British, for a man to be of good family in order to receive and retain an appointment on the staff. He must show evident signs of ability too. He must, in addition, have passed through the Staff College, where the most thorough military training in the world was given. This was one of my anxieties. Adolf had taken this course, and I had not. On the contrary, I had been a soldier but 15 months. Nevertheless, 15 months of actual service to a man who kept his eyes wide open might be more valuable than 3 years, even in the most efficiently conducted staff college. I was determined, too, not to hazard my position for a mere trifle. It would be very easy for me to pick up fragments of information which would be valuable, nay, invaluable, to the British or French command, but I was determined right from the start, and had stated my intention categorically to the War Office in London, that I was only going to risk my job and my life for something of major importance. It would go against the grain doing my job as a staff officer efficiently, and thereby perhaps helping to take the lives of Englishmen and Frenchmen, but nevertheless there was always the great possibility that I might at some time or other do my country a service that would far outweigh such minor calamities. For alas, what is a life in war time? A dead soldier means a great deal to his relatives and friends, but you have to talk of the dead in thousands before you make any impression on a military mind. I had, for the purpose of my job, to drop my humanity and become a real professional soldier, considering, as the professional soldier does, men as so many pawns in the game. If he thinks otherwise, if he allows his human side to come out on top of him, then he will not be a tremendously successful commander. At the very moment when he should be stern, his heart will speak instead of his mind, and the battle will be lost. This, then, was my intention, to do my job well and thoroughly in the proper German manner, and by doing so to gain the confidence of my superiors. If I could do this, then one day vital information would almost certainly fall into my hands. On such an occasion, but only on such an occasion. I would risk everything. It might have been easy, had I not been nervous about the potentialities, to send a whole series of messages to England. After all, how would it be possible to trace the sender? But I distrusted very strongly a good many of the agents employed in France and Belgium. One out of every three, perhaps, was a sincere man or woman who was undertaking spy work for love of his country, and not for British gold. But who was to say which was the one man, and which were the other two? For this question of communication is the spy's greatest difficulty. Again, I complain of the standard spy story, which shows how information is most ingeniously obtained, usually too ingeniously, but passes lightly over the bigger problem, how to pass that information to his base. I decided at the outset that only in the most exceptional circumstances would I use the organized postman, and never the codes and secret inks so beloved of the fictional spy. I had worked out my own methods of communication, much simpler than those of popular fancy, but very effective and almost impossible of detection by the German censor. They depended on keen brains and intelligent minds in the receivers, but contrary to the prevailing idea of the day, the War Office was not entirely staffed by congenial idiots. Certainly, every message I sent home was correctly deciphered. I had been instructed to report to Major General Zwellner, who was Chief of Staff to General von Falkenhayn, who, of course, was Chief of the General Staff, which means that he was the real Commander-in-Chief of the German armies. The titular command, of course, rested with the Kaiser, but his influence throughout the whole of the war was almost negligible, and nobody seemed to make the slightest pretense of consulting him. It might be as well here, in fact, to explain to the ordinary reader something of the German method of command. Every German army has a commander, who was usually a royal prince, or otherwise some general of dignified character. As an assistant, he had a chief of staff, and for all practical purposes, the chief of staff commanded the army. When the army groups commanded by the Crown Prince of Germany and the Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria were preparing a battle, it was not their royal commanders who met to discuss it, but the respective chiefs of staff, and surely all the world knows by now the relationship between Hindenburg and his chief of staff. I could not expect to be lucky always. I was not posted to the operations branch, as I had hoped, but to the intelligence branch. This, however, was a second best, particularly in the German army, where the branch was strongly developed and where more attention was paid to its prophecies and warnings than in the Allied armies. I had already discovered, to my cost, that the intelligence branch of the British Army might do a great deal of honest work and make a remarkably accurate forecast, only to be completely ignored by the operations side. In the French army, the condition of affairs was almost worse. I found as my chief Colonel Nicolai, who was probably the most successful intelligence officer on either side throughout the whole of the war. He received me very kindly, and explained that he had asked for me purposely because of the knowledge of England which I possessed, not only during the few weeks of my captivity, of course, but because of the visits I had paid to my distant relatives in England before the war. He had heard, too, of my fluent English. He tried me out, and was naturally very satisfied with my prowess in this direction. Thus I found that my first job was one which I feared might come along. I was to work directly against my own country. However, it had to be done, and of course it might always be possible to leave out something vital in my reports. After a few days, in which I was instructed to accustom myself to the routine of headquarters, I found myself posted with 2 other officers in a small room. Here we dealt with masses of reports which came in from the German divisions, corps, and armies operating against the British. There were captured British orders, reports of units in the line, reports of examination of prisoners, and so on. My own job for the first month or 2 at headquarters was to prepare the battle order of the British forces facing the Germans, that is to say, to identify the positions of the various British divisions along the front, numbering them whenever possible, and stating their exact location. Whenever I was in doubt, I could always ask the army concerned to take drastic action to secure an identification, which usually meant a trench raid to capture a prisoner. Any fears that I had held that my lack of staff college training might be fatal to my chances immediately disappeared. I had already done this actual job on the British side of the line, and was quite confident of my ability to do it on the German. In fact, before I had been so employed, for a few weeks I had already received several compliments. This pleased me immensely, for Colonel Nicolai was not a man who flung away bouquets. He was a tremendously hard and efficient worker himself, and expected all his staff to follow his example. He had no place for the slacker, and no place for the man of routine. He wanted men with ideas, and anyone who did not come up to his standards was ruthlessly thrown aside. I was glad, therefore, that my first impression was a good one, for I wanted to hang on in this interesting place. Certainly something was bound to turn up before long. In my first week, nothing happened to disturb my equanimity. All these officers were strangers to Adolphe and to me, and naturally they accepted me without any question. The details of my escape were now well known throughout Germany, and had been published with my photograph in most of the newspapers. The photograph reproduced on the coarse surface of the German newspapers resembled me as much as it did any man, but also resembled Adolphe to the same extent. To clinch matters, assuming that they needed any clinching, Freiberg, the naval lieutenant with whom I had made my escape, came down on a flying visit to see me after his leave was exhausted, before he rejoined the submarine base at Wilhelmshaven. As he happened to be a relative of General Groner, the director of Field Railway Services at General Headquarters, the introductions which he made were of the greatest value, After his visit, certainly the General Staff would as soon have thought of suspecting Falkenhayn himself as of suspecting me. It was not until my second week, then, that I had my first shock, for then, walking along the streets of Charleville, from my office to the house which served as a mess, I heard hurried footsteps behind me and turned round to face a young officer who was glowing with excitement. He flung his hand out and grasped mine, wringing it so heartily that my fingers felt the strain. "Well, by all that's good and beautiful," he cried, "now isn't this great? Just the man I was looking for." Now, although I had got Adolphe to talk as long as I could about all his friends and acquaintances, and had secured all his photographs, I could not trace this man. I did not know him from Adam. All that I could be certain was that he was not one of Adolphe's friends from Baden, because I must have met him in the days before the war. Probably he was a military acquaintance. There is, however, an ancient device to adopt on such occasions. It often happens that you are accosted by some acquaintance, a man you know you ought to know, yet can't exactly place. The obvious thing to do is to let him go on talking. Then some time or other he is bound to say something that will give you the necessary clue to identification. I did this. I let him talk on in his excitement. He had read about me in the papers, he said. He would have welcomed me himself to General Headquarters, but he had been on leave at the time. He had only to come back the day before, and was waiting for an hour's leisure to ferret me out. And now, here at lunch-time, he had walked right into me, and so on, and so on. I did not give myself away. I was as enthusiastic as he was. I was very careful to mention no names, and to keep the conversation general. "Are you still on the same job?" I asked at length. "No," he replied. "My old leg wound troubled me again, and so I had to transfer to a clerical office. I am in charge of the Chief Bureau now. A very important job, although it isn't quite what we thought of that day when we walked into action for the first time at Charleroi. Is it? Do you remember how we were going to win the Iron Cross together? And now you've got it, and I haven't. Dear, dear, never mind, it's all in a wartime." Another 2 minutes, and I had him completely placed. His name was Konrad Amur, and as soon as he mentioned it, I recalled that Adolphe had spoken of him on several occasions. He was a young subaltern who had served under Adolphe, but had been rather severely wounded in the early battles of 1915, and now apparently he too had a staff job, and one which, if not so interesting, and if offering no scope of individuality, definitely controlled the innermost secrets of the German command. Obviously, this stroke of luck must be exploited. I arranged to meet Amur that night. During the afternoon, my eyes were staring at the report I was supposed to be considering, but actually I was thinking very hard how I could best use this happy opportunity. Nevertheless, nothing must be rushed. My first efforts must be thought out most carefully. I had already made up my mind that this war was going to be a long one. I knew that Joffre and Foch would disagree with me very violently, although Falkenhayn would not. If therefore I risked everything on one throw, I might win a battle. But if the war was to go on for another 2 or 3 years, that would be no great advantage, for it was certain that never again would an English agent find himself in such a happy position as I was now. It would be folly to waste such a chance for a mere detail of espionage. I was thinking all the while of bigger things, not of stealing plans or trifles of that kind, but of Liddell Hart's words, that the aim of the battle is the mind of the enemy commander. It will take me a long time to penetrate to such a depth, but I was certain that it could be done. In the meantime, there were other trifles of useful information that I might possibly be able to get over without risk. One of them came my way just before Christmas 1915. Since mine was a reporting and not a directing branch, I could not expect to get any absolutely vital information from my own work. Accordingly, I studied the possibilities of getting stuff from Amur's office. I palled up to him warmly, and I may say sincerely, for he was a very likable fellow, and made a habit of calling for him at least once a day at his office. Thus the whole of his staff, numbering some 15 or 16 clerks, got to know me very well by name and sight, and I could walk into his office without any question. He had 3 rooms, one a large room occupied by the general clerks. In a corner of it, partitioned off, was a smaller room where 3 military clerks worked. Here were prepared documents of the most secret kind. No one except Amur, his personal clerk, and certain officers of the general staff were ever allowed to enter. The 3rd room was Amur's, adjoining the other, with a communicating door. My first job, therefore, was to get the entree to this confidential room. This was easy, since Amur was in charge of it, and was a friend of mine. It was helped, too, by the fact that my escape from England gave me a certain notoriety among the men, for it will always be remarked that soldiers who are employed on clerical work have always a big grain of admiration for men who have actually faced danger. About 3 days before Christmas, 1915, Amur and I were conversing over dinner. Both of us had had visions of leave. For my part, I didn't want it, but Amur did, most emphatically. However, he complained that his high hopes looked like being dashed. For the chief, that is to say, Falkenhayn, had been busy for some days, getting together an appreciation of the situation and a forecast of future operations. This said, Amur would have to be typed and distributed to a number of people, a very responsible task which he himself would have to supervise personally. He was just hoping that Falkenhayn would get the job done quickly. Naturally, this interested me greatly. I kept my eyes very much open whenever I invaded Amur's office. 2 days later, when I called for him at lunch, I found him in the confidential room. A big table was strewn with papers, which one of the clerks had just typed. Murr himself was going carefully through each sheet, checking it off against a draft beside him on the table. I needed to be no Sherlock Holmes to know this was the report at which he had hinted, nor did I need to be a minister of state to guess that it might be a thing of the utmost importance, worth perhaps even the risk of my position to find out its purpose. "What's happening?" I asked Murr, who looked rather worried. "Oh, this damned report of the chief's," he said. "I've got to get it out this afternoon. I'm afraid I shan't be ready for lunch for an hour or so yet." "Shall I give you a hand?" I asked. "I wish you would," he said. "I've been instructed not to let any of the clerks see it except the chief confidential typist, so I've got to do the rest of the clerical business myself. I'm just finishing the checking of it, but now I've got to number the copies." I sat down beside him. If only I could purloin one of the copies, as the fictional spy would have done, but at once I dismissed the idea. It was quite impossible. Every one must be scrupulously accounted for. Every one would be numbered, and would be sent to some high dignitary, being marked out in a confidential register, as it moved from place to place. So that was hopeless, but at least if I helped Murr to number the sheets, I could get a glimpse of the contents. I did. As he called out the registered numbers to me, I inserted them on the top of each sheet. 7 copies had been stamped through on the typewriter, and each one had to be numbered separately. I did it leisurely in my best handwriting, which meant I had the chance of at least a glance at each sheet, and when I got the idea of the contents of the report, my hair almost stood on end with excitement. Yes, this was definitely something of first-class importance. I was still in difficulty, however. Obviously, by the time I had numbered all the sheets, I would have in my mind a fairly accurate precise of what Falkenhayn had written. I knew immediately that this would be invaluable to the Allied commands, yet it was essential that I should have some documentary evidence to back up my report, for few intelligence services trusted the word which might only be the opinion of any agent, however reliable he might be. Before information could be acted upon, it must be checked. As I have said, there was no hope whatsoever of stealing one of the copies, but I had already noticed in previous visits the neat and tidy habits of the elderly soldier who did this side of the clerical work. Now typists have 2 methods with carbons when typing a long report. Some use one set of carbon papers only, changing them from sheet to sheet as the page is completed. This is perhaps the more economical. Others use half a box of carbons for one job, inserting fresh sheets of carbon paper between the separate pages and keeping all together until the whole job is completed. The advantage of this is that the checking can be left until the end, and any corrections can then be made without a fresh insertion of carbon papers. This was the method that the soldier clerk had used. Before I numbered the different pages, I had to slip the 6 carbons from between the different sheets. Here, immediately, was an idea. When I came to the last page, I saw that it contained the crux of the whole matter. What was easier then, as I pulled the carbons from the sheets, to drop 2 of them carelessly on the floor. Immediately I made a dive to pick them up, but I replaced only one on the pile. The other, crumpled maybe, but nevertheless intact, found a resting place just inside the side of my boot. As soon as the job was done, I shuffled the carbon into position and replaced them in the box. Assuredly, no one would ever think of counting the carbons, nor did they. After helping Amur to address the copies, which were to go out, including one which went direct to the Kaiser, and registering them under the numbers I had just affixed to them, I went out with him to lunch with a light heart. I had now something tangible and desperately important to show for the risk which I had been running for the past few weeks. Yet how to get it over to England? That night, in my billet, I straightened out the carbon and carefully pressed it flat between heavy books. It was, of course, a new carbon, and bore but the one imprint. By holding it to the light or the mirror, it was quite easy to decipher. In any case, I had already got a very good idea of its contents from my looking over while numbering the copies. For the report that I had read, or at least skimmed, was one of the most remarkable documents penned during the whole of the war. In it, Falkenhayn reviewed the war up to date and the possibilities of the future. He affirmed in his appreciation that England was the main enemy, but that it was almost impossible to reach England because of the strength of her navy and the strip of water in between. He argued that England was pursuing her historic policy of maintaining a foreign army on the continent to fight her battles for her. The army on this occasion was French, not German, as had happened 100 years before. Therefore, he said, before we can get at England, we must strike her sword out of her hand, her sword being France. So he argued against a big offensive on the Russian front, which had been advocated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and declared in favor of a tremendous onslaught on the French. The last page summarized his views. It read, "Within our reach, behind the French sector of the Western Front, there are objectives for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death, as there can be no question of a voluntary withdrawal whether we reach our goal or not. If they do not do so, and we reach our objective, the moral effect on France will be tremendous. For an operation limited to a narrow front, Germany will not be compelled to spend herself so completely that all other fronts are practically drained. She can face with confidence the relief attacks to be expected on those fronts, and indeed hope to have sufficient troops in hand to reply to them with counterattacks, for she is perfectly free to accelerate or draw out her offensive, to intensify it or break it off from time to time, as suits her purpose. The objectives of which I am speaking now are Belfort and Verdun. The considerations urged above apply to both, yet the preference must be given to Verdun. The French lines at that point are barely 12 miles distant from the German railway communications. Verdun is therefore the most powerful point d'appui for an attempt, with a relatively small expenditure and effort, to make the whole German front in France and Belgium untenable. The removal of the danger as a secondary aim would be so valuable on military grounds that, compared with it, the, so to speak, incidental political victory of the purification of Alsace by an attack on Belfort is a small matter. My only difficulty now was to get the carbon and my report across to England. I typed out from memory the gist of the whole appreciation, which Falkenhayn had written, using his actual phrases when I could remember them. On comparing this report years afterwards with the full document, I found that I had done very well. Probably my training as an actor made rapid memorization possible. This I dispatched, utterly devoid of any means of identification, to an address at Brussels, where lived one of the most enterprising of our Secret Service agents. In order to ensure that a copy reached him, I sent a second 3 days later. The carbon, however, I decided to send myself, and not to trust in transit to any intermediary, however honest and able lie might be. The English intelligence service, directed against Germany, had its centers in Holland and Switzerland. There our agents worked in the guise of perfectly ordinary merchants, as indeed they were in their spare time. I had memorized half a dozen addresses to which letters might be addressed, yet there was always the danger, of course, that one of these addresses might have been found out by the Germans, who would naturally watch and inspect very carefully all letters addressed to it. It so happened, however, that an old friend of my father's was working as a technical expert at the great electrical works of Moss & Co. at Edenhoven in Holland, a firm now known almost as well for its wireless equipment and continental broadcast as for its electrical amps. This old family friend had of course no connection whatsoever with any espionage business, nor did he wish to have, for a more quiet, inoffensive little man never lived, but before I had entered Germany, scenting the possibility of such an occasion, I had got my father to write to him, if he received any letters of any kind, which he did not understand, he was asked to send it on at once to England. I had not heard from my father that his friend had consented, but I had no doubt about it, although the old man would have fallen stiff with horror at the idea of being used as a spy. He could have no problem, no objection to readdressing a letter which reached him. My plan then was this. I took Amur to celebrate Christmas, for his leave, after all, had not materialized, to a hotel at Liège. There I wrote 1 or 2 letters, and in the course of writing purloined 1 or 2 sheets of paper and envelopes bearing the name of the hotel. I wrote to Messrs. Moss and Company, in the guise of one of their commercial travelers, of whom they must have had dozens touring Belgium and Germany, even during war-time. I said that I was on the track of a very good order. A big concern in Liège had had a breakdown with an electrical apparatus and wanted a complete refitment. I enclosed a complete schedule and specification of their requirements, and asked for an estimate to be sent to me right away, giving the address where I would be in a week's time, in order that they could get all branches of the estimates section working at once. I said I had typed out the specification in triplicate and enclosed all 3 copies. This I did, copying out a specification from an electrical catalog, a perfectly normal affair that any firm could quote for. Then I attached the letter to the 3 copies of the specification, and by accident one of the carbons used was left in between the second and third copy. This I hoped and assumed would be the opinion of the censor when he opened the letter. It was not an absolutely foolproof scheme, but it seemed to me to offer a good chance of success, at least as large as those of the normal methods of communication, in which I had no great faith. Anyway, it did come off. My father's friend received the letter, wondered what on earth it was all about, and almost took it seriously at first until he realized that it was absurd that such an inquiry should have come from a commercial traveler to him instead of to the costing side of the business. Then my father's letter came to his mind, and immediately he sent it on to England. 2 days later my father walked into the War Office triumphantly, for his natural curiosity had led him to examine the carbon intently, and he had had no difficulty in deciphering its message. Nor was he disappointed at his reception, for the usually phlegmatic intelligence officer who received him grinned all over his face when he saw that little penny, halfpenny sheet of carbon paper which my father placed before him. Although perhaps it should not be I who says it, this was one of the most complete disclosures of the whole of the war. Not only was Falkenhayn's plan to attack thoroughly revealed, but I was able to give an approximate date, weeks before the actual day of the battle was decided. In my covering letter I had pointed out that the whole equipment would be required to be delivered before the end of February, so when, by means of a field postcard sent to me, ostensibly from a brother officer in an English prison camp, I knew that my plan had not miscarried. I sat back in my chair at my billet and chuckled out loud. I felt that I had really done something big. Here Falkenhayn had planned to surprise the French at Verdun. Now I had been able to give them at least 6 weeks' warning. In that time they could make such preparations as would pulverize and annihilate the threatened attack. But did it? All the world now knows the story of Verdun, how the place had been declassed as a fortress by Joffre so that he could obtain the command of its garrison, how the troops on the spot saw signs of an imminent offensive, how the governor of Verdun, General Contecau, shared this view but was immediately dismissed when he expressed it, how Colonel Dryant, the deputy for Nancy, and a well-known military writer sent the warning direct to General Gallieni, who was Minister for War, how Joffre pooh-poohed the idea, and in his famous reply, which ought to serve as the standard example of ridiculous red tape throughout history, exclaimed, "But since these apprehensions are founded on reports which allege defects in the state of the defenses, I request you to specify their authors. I cannot be a party to soldiers under my command, bringing before the government, by channels other than the hierarchic channels, complaints or protests concerning the execution of my orders. It is calculated to disturb profoundly the spirit of discipline in the army. What a state of affairs it was, that a commander should prefer to receive no information at all, rather than that not rendered in the official and red-tape fashion. If Joffre took no notice of the warning of Colonel Dryant, naturally he would take even less of mine. My report, together with the carbon paper, was duly passed on to the French commander, with the covering expression that they came from a British officer, who was to be trusted in every respect. Actually, the War Office made a mistake. They should have sent my report to Gallieni, and not Joffre. Then something drastic might have been done, for Gallieni was a man of action, not one who went to sleep every afternoon and every night, whatever the state of the battle. Naturally, it piqued my personal pride when later I found that no advantage had been taken of the risk I had run, and it hurt me to the quick when I heard, as I did in succeeding weeks, of the cruel losses which the gallant French poilus suffered through complete lack of preparation. Everyone now knows how near was the French line to crashing. Everyone now knows that only the narrowest of margins separated the German onslaught from complete success, a victory which would have changed the whole course of the war. How easily the cruel losses of the desperate defense might have been avoided, might have been, that is the saddest phrase in any tongue.